The heat in Eleanor Vance's small guest room was oppressive, a suffocating counterpoint to the chill that had settled in her soul. She hadn't noticed the precise moment the warmth of her family turned to ice, but she felt the cold now, deep in her bones, even in the coastal city of Azure Bay. She tried to distract herself by folding towels, but the silence, that heavy, expectant silence of a house where secrets are buried, was broken by a whisper. It was low, meant for private ears, but Eleanor, a woman who had spent a lifetime listening for the sound of a sick child's cough or the quiet tread of a guilty teenager, heard everything. The words, delivered with a casual cruelty that made her lungs seize, were worse than any scream. They called her dead weight. What they didn't know was that Eleanor carried more than her own small suitcase. She carried the financial skeleton of the roof over their heads, a receipt for every insult, a ledger balanced in secret. And soon she would drop that weight, leaving them to reckon with the heavy foundation she had kept from crumbling for 3 long years. The towel slipped from Eleanor's trembling hand, dampening instantly on the polished marble counter. The sound of it hitting the surface was swallowed by the house, a grand modern structure on Sycamore Lane that felt alien and cold compared to the small, sturdy brick home she had sacrificed for its purchase. "You need to say something," Vivian hissed, her tone sharp as broken glass, impatiently cutting through the kitchen air. Eleanor could picture her daughter-in-law perfectly. Tight posture, eyes narrowed, irritation and almost palpable force around her. "Your mother can't live with us forever. She's not helping, she just takes up space," Vivian continued, her words tight with impatience. "She raised you," Dominic mumbled weakly. "That's not the point," Vivian snapped. "We've got bills, stress, and she just sits there all day. She's dead weight." Eleanor stood in the doorway, the words forming a dense knot in her chest. "Dead weight." She stepped softly onto the threshold. "I heard you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, considering the earthquake raging inside. Vivian flinched, startled, turning sharply. Dominic spun around, his eyes wide and vacant. "Mom, that's not what she meant," he stammered, already retreating. "It is," Eleanor stated simply. "You just didn't think I'd be listening." They offered no defense, no apology, just the profound silence of the cot. Eleanor walked back into the kitchen, picked up the dropped towel, and folded the last one meticulously, her hands shaking only slightly. Her heart beat slowly, deliberately, a strong, rhythmic drum against the silence. She had lived long enough to know the damage of careless words, but still some words stayed, embedding themselves like shrapnel. That evening, the atmosphere at the dinner table was brittle, threatening to shatter with any movement. Arthritis had been a cruel companion recently, twisting her joints and stealing her steady grip. As Eleanor attempted to place the heavy ceramic bowl of lentil soup, Dominic's favorite, a futile attempt to bridge the chasm between them, her hand betrayed her. The bowl slipped crashing down. Hot broth saturated the crisp tablecloth and splashed onto Vivian's lap. "Seriously?" Vivian hissed, leaping up, her face instantly contorted with fury. "I'm sorry," Eleanor murmured, already reaching for a napkin. Before she could move, Vivian struck her hand away. A hard, sharp slap, and then unforgivably struck her face. The sting was secondary to the shock, but the true agony was the silence that followed. Dominic stood rigid, frozen. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation from his wife. He simply looked at Eleanor, then looked away. In that moment of utter abandonment, Eleanor understood. He would not defend her, not even against a blow to the face. Just then the front door opened. "Mom!" It was Serafina's voice, Eleanor's youngest daughter, the one she hadn't seen in over a year. Serafina stood at the threshold, a worn suitcase at her feet, her expression stunned. Eleanor knew why she was here. 3 days ago, Serafina had called, weeping uncontrollably, having just finalized her divorce. Serafina immediately saw the red mark blossoming on Eleanor's cheek, the mess of the spilled soup, and the way her mother was holding herself together with sheer shame. Her eyes locked onto Vivian, and she didn't pause for thought or hesitation. The slap that followed echoed loudly in the dining room, sharp and decisive. Vivian staggered back, stunned. "You touch my mother again and I will break both your hands," Serafina stated, her teeth clenched, her voice a low, terrifying snarl. Dominic finally moved, jumping to his feet. "What the hell, Sarah? You don't live here. You don't get to come in here and act like some hero," he shouted. Serafina turned slowly to her brother. "You let your wife hit Mom and said nothing. You let her call Mom a burden and just stood there like a coward," she accused. "She's not helping us." Dominic snapped back, the fear in his voice rapidly turning to venomous anger. "She just takes up space, just like you. A divorced parasite who ran back to her mother the second life got hard." Serafina recoiled as if he had struck her as well. "Both of you are useless," Dominic spat. That was when Eleanor stepped between them. "Enough," she commanded. Both children froze. She looked at Serafina. "You're not useless." Then she turned to Dominic, her voice clear and without inflection. "And you're not my son anymore." Dominic's mouth opened, but no sound escaped. Eleanor simply turned and walked away, settling into her usual chair by the window. It was the chair they often claimed she stared out of like a ghost. But she wasn't a ghost. She was very much alive, and she was done. There had been a time when Eleanor truly believed that giving unconditionally would guarantee love, that the more she sacrificed, the more she would be cherished. She believed loyalty, paid forward in silent action, would echo back as warmth. She was profoundly wrong. She thought of the brick home she had owned, the paint peeling on the porch, the stubborn plumbing, the house where she had raised Dominic since he was 9. It was bought with every graveyard shift she worked, every penny she saved by mending clothes and skipping vacations. That house had seen her through widowhood, through Dominic's college years, and through the toughest winters. When Dominic and Vivian were expecting their second child, they approached her with tones of hope and wide, expectant eyes. "There's this perfect house, Mom," Dominic had said, describing the good schools, the yard, the room for everyone. "But we're short on the down payment." Eleanor didn't even hesitate. "How much do you need?" They named a figure, and she wired it within a week. She never asked to be on the deed. She didn't want them to feel burdened. "Just a home for the babies," she had told herself, believing they would understand the enormity of her gesture. They didn't. She moved into their guest room, a space tucked between the laundry area and the garage, lacking a window, containing only a mattress on the floor. She rationalized it to herself. "It is enough. I'm close to the grandchildren. Can help. Can belong." And she did help. Far more than they would ever admit. She watched the children every weekday, managing pickups, drop-offs, fevers, nightmares, homework and bedtime songs. She cooked dinner most nights, washed their clothes, and repaired ripped backpacks, never once asking for a single cent. One month, she noticed a financial envelope on the kitchen counter marked, "Final Notice. Mortgage." Dominic casually brushed it off, muttering about Vivian having to leave her job early and things being tight. Eleanor quietly paid it. She then set up a monthly automatic payment to cover exactly half the mortgage, never telling them. She didn't want to embarrass her son. Month after month, she paid, and they never once inquired where the money was coming from. Perhaps they simply didn't care. The contempt began slowly. At first, it was small things. Vivian rolling her eyes when Eleanor offered to prepare lunch, or sharply correcting her when she shared old family stories with the children. "Mom, don't confuse them," Vivian would say. "They're learning a different way now." Then came the more significant slights. "I think we need more space," Vivian commented one afternoon, pointedly glancing at the small guest room and suggesting it could become a playroom. Eleanor said nothing. She just nodded and gathered her knitting. Another day, Eleanor overheard Vivian on the phone. "No, she doesn't pay rent, but she eats, uses water, electricity, it adds up." Once, while handing Eleanor a lengthy shopping list, Vivian added, "Might be nice if you started picking up your own groceries. I mean, you do eat a lot of yogurt." Dominic never intervened. When Eleanor sought his eyes for comfort, he always looked away. The worst part, she reflected, was that she kept trying. She baked Vivian's favorite bread even after Vivian called her recipes dated. She folded Vivian's laundry when it sat in the machine for days. She sewed buttons onto her blouses. Vivian rarely noticed, and when she did speak to Eleanor, it was often to remind her, "You're lucky we have space for you, not every family does." She repeated this, as if the thousands Eleanor had contributed, the meals she cooked, and the nights spent awake holding her crying grandchild were all favors she should be thanking them for. And Dominic, her sweet boy who once made her birthday cards out of dried macaroni, simply allowed it. He stood beside Vivian, silent. The evening she burned the rice, Vivian walked into the kitchen, sniffed the air and laughed. "Eleanor, I guess you really are getting old," she mocked. Dominic said nothing. That night, Eleanor sat on the back steps, the azure bay humidity thick on her skin, staring at the blurred horizon. How many times had she given them the last slice, the warmest blanket, the best part of herself? She thought of the porch swing on her old house, the daffodils, her name carved messily into the pantry beam beside Dominic's fourth-grade letters. All gone, given away. Still she stayed because mothers stay, even when treated like furniture, when kindness is repaid with contempt, when their name is spoken only as an inconvenience. But the slap, the moment Vivian's fingers met her cheek, the second Dominic didn't move, that was the shift. That shift solidified into resolve. Eleanor called the bank on a Tuesday morning. There was no drama, no tears, and no raised voice. She calmly confirmed what she already knew. Her name was still listed as the payee on the monthly mortgage, despite not being on the deed. The woman on the phone was polite, reading the unusual numbers from the file. "Yes, Mrs. Vance, it looks like you've been making partial payments since July, and also an additional lump sum last December. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Eleanor confirmed. "And would you like to continue these payments?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'd like to stop today." Silence hung on the line. "I'd also like the remaining balance, all future communications, and every financial document going forward redirected to the homeowners, Dominic and Vivian Vance." "Of course. I can finalize that request today," the woman said. "Please do," Eleanor replied. "And email me a copy of the confirmation." She hung up, opened her laptop, and printed the bank letter that arrived 2 hours later. She folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope, alongside the final receipt for her last payment. That afternoon, she cooked Dominic's favorite lentil soup. She baked bread. She set the table with 3 plates, and in the center beside the salt shaker, she placed the envelope. When they arrived home, she greeted them as if nothing had changed. Vivian dropped her heels on the floor. Dominic followed, still engrossed in his phone. Dinner was quiet, marked only by the clink of cutlery and the ticking wall clock. When their plates were nearly clean, Eleanor reached for the envelope and slid it between them. "What's that?" Vivian asked, barely glancing up. Eleanor wiped her hands slowly on her napkin. "That," she said, "is the last mortgage payment I will ever make." Vivian blinked. "Excuse me. I called the bank this morning," Eleanor explained, turning to her. "I told them to send everything to the legal homeowners, you too. From now on, all responsibility is yours." Vivian's mouth dropped open, silent. Dominic finally looked up from his plate, confusion and dread mixing in his eyes. "Mom," he began. "I heard you," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Last week in the living room." I turned to Vivian. "You said I was dead weight." Vivian scoffed. "That's not." "Yes, it is," Eleanor cut her off. "And now I'm removing the weight." Dominic's face flushed red, and his gaze dropped back to the table. "I've paid this house for 3 years," Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "Half the mortgage, the down payment, groceries, repairs. I've cooked your meals, raised your children, and stayed quiet when you rolled your eyes and turned away when you turned cold." She reached down and lifted her small suitcase, which she had placed beside her chair. "But now the givers are done giving." Vivian jumped up, her voice rising in panic. "You can't just leave. What about the kids? You can't just drop this on us. I can, Eleanor affirmed. And I am. Dominic looked small again, like a boy caught doing something wrong, utterly lost. Mom, please, let's talk, he pleaded. Eleanor turned to him. My son, you let her slap me, she said, low and calm. You let her call me names, and when your sister stood up for me, you called her trash. You stood behind her every time, even when you knew she was wrong. His eyes filled with tears, but he remained silent. I'll be gone in the morning, she concluded. You'll get the keys back. You can convert the guest room. Do what you like. Where will you go? He whispered. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, strong smile. Where I'm not dead weight. She wheeled her small suitcase to the bottom of the stairs and climbed slowly to gather her few remaining possessions. A photo album, a few sweaters, and her late husband's watch. That night, she slept heavily, deeply, like a stone. In the morning, before the sun rose over Sycamore Lane, she brewed coffee one last time in their kitchen. She placed her house key on the counter next to the cooling cup of coffee. No note, no goodbyes, just a final act of routine. At 5:40 a.m., she heard the quiet click of the door closing behind her, beginning her long, quiet walk toward freedom. Eleanor told no one she was leaving. She packed what was essential: a week's worth of clothes, her birth certificate, her pension papers, her mother's recipe box handwritten with loving instructions, and a photo of Dominic and Serafina as toddlers, mouths sticky with watermelon. She rolled her suitcase down the street toward the bus stop, the wheels clicking softly on the pavement. The morning air was thick with the quiet of a neighbor watering his lawn. He waved and she waved back, knowing he had no idea she was disappearing. The Greyhound bus was old, the vinyl seats cracked and the air stale, but it felt secure. She sat near the window, watching the city shrink behind her, the place where she had lived like a shadow in someone else's house. She didn't weep. There was nothing left to grieve. She rode through the sleepy hills of the state, heading toward the warm, comforting breath of the South. Hours passed in silence. She ate saltines from her coat pocket and wrote a few lines in her journal, staring out at the fields. She thought of Serafina, the daughter she hadn't seen in a year, who now lived in the coastal city of Azure Bay. The last time they spoke, Serafina was whispering through tears, I think I'm done. I just don't know how to leave him. Eleanor recognized that voice. She had used it herself. When she finally arrived, the air in Azure Bay felt soft and welcoming. She stepped off the bus into sunlight and the sound of cicadas. Serafina lived in a modest apartment complex just outside the town center. The building was beige, the railings chipped, the sidewalk cracked. Eleanor climbed the stairs and knocked twice. When Serafina opened the door, her breath hitched. Mom, she whispered. She looked thinner, her eyes tired, her lips slightly swollen beneath a faint smear of makeup. Serafina had always been good at covering bruises. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring, and Eleanor noticed she wasn't wearing hers either. They simply looked at each other, two women worn thin from being silent too long. Then Serafina stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. There were no words, just warmth, the kind of embrace given only when something internal finally breaks open. Eleanor held her, feeling like they had both survived houses where love came with conditions, where silence was safer than truth, and where the cost of staying was losing one's own reflection. The apartment was small, one bedroom, furnished with second-hand pieces. The air conditioner rattled constantly, threatening to quit, but it was clean, lived in and real. I was just making tea, Serafina said, wiping her face. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. Serafina placed the cup in front of her, sat across from her, and reached for her hand. There were no questions like, "Why are you here?" or "What happened?" They just sat, two women who had finally come home to each other. Serafina moved quietly around the apartment during those first few days, like she was always bracing for an impact. She flinched violently when her phone buzzed. She kept her back to the windows and locked every door twice at night. Eleanor didn't press her for details. She folded laundry while Serafina worked late shifts, made soup, and left small, encouraging notes beside her coffee mug. She swept the floor and waited. One rainy night, as the taps danced gently on the glass, they sat together on the worn couch. Finally, Serafina spoke the words Eleanor knew were buried deep within her. "He calls me garbage," she whispered. She stared at the floor, unable to meet her mother's eyes. "Not just when we fight," she clarified. "All the time. When I forget to take out the trash when dinner is late, when I speak too softly, too loudly, when I breathe wrong." Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. "He took my car keys last month," she revealed, her voice barely audible. "He said I didn't deserve to leave, that if I left, no one would take me back. He said even my own mother wouldn't want me." She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes filled with something deeper than sadness. Was he right? Eleanor's throat tightened. She reached for Serafina's cold, trembling hand, so different from the small fingers she used to braid hair for before school. "He's wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "He was always wrong." Serafina tried to speak, then broke down, sobbing into her mother's lap like a frightened child. Eleanor stroked her hair, just as she had when Serafina was 5 and afraid of thunder. That night, Serafina told her everything. How the bruises were not always from falling, how he checked her phone nightly, how he once forced her to kneel on the bathroom floor for an hour because she bought the wrong kind of milk. She hadn't noticed she had stopped laughing 2 years ago until this moment. Eleanor held her, not crying but holding. When the tears dried, Eleanor spoke softly. "If you can't leave yet, I'll take you. I'll carry you out myself if I have to." Over the next few weeks, they slowly untangled Serafina's life. Serafina started saving her paychecks in a hidden envelope. Eleanor helped her list the essential items she would need to take. They practiced what she would say, who she could call, where she could go. But fear is a deeply rooted companion. "I don't want to start over," Serafina whispered one morning. "I'm 39. I'm tired. What if I fail?" Eleanor took her hands. "You're not starting over," she countered. "You're picking up where someone else tried to end you." And then something shifted. Serafina began to walk straighter. She smiled sometimes, not forced but genuine. She stopped checking the windows every hour. One Sunday afternoon, she stood in the doorway, holding a thick envelope with hands that still trembled slightly. "Divorce papers," she announced. "I signed them." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Serafina nodded. "It's time." Eleanor rose and wrapped her arms around her daughter. "You saved me," Serafina whispered into her shoulder. "No," Eleanor corrected. "We saved each other," realizing that in Serafina's newfound freedom, she had cemented her own. They found their new home almost by accident. It was a small, tucked-away place on the edge of town, located above a seafood market and only one street over from the beach. The paint was chipped, the plumbing temperamental, but the windows were oriented to catch the sunrise perfectly, as if they were specifically built to remember beauty. Serafina held the lease in the doorway, her eyes shining with tentative hope. "Can we really do this?" she asked. "We already are," Eleanor assured her. They moved in a week later with minimal possessions. A few bags of clothes, a kettle, 2 folding chairs, and a second-hand sofa that vaguely smelled of cinnamon. They brought only the parts of themselves they were learning to love. The past was left behind. Their days settled into a restorative rhythm. Serafina began selling handmade jewelry online, a college hobby she had revived. Eleanor helped with the packaging and shipping, learning the codes and tools. They set up a small corner of the living room with boxes, twine, and tissue paper. Every sale felt like a vital victory, a tangible piece of Serafina's independence being delivered. Eleanor started baking again. Small batches of butter rolls, banana bread, oatmeal cookies. They posted a few photos, and within weeks, they were taking local orders from tourists and neighbors. They named their enterprise Mother and Daughter Goods. And the name stuck. They didn't earn much, but they didn't require much. Each morning, Eleanor rose with the light, brewed strong tea, and sat by the open window with her journal. She wrote not to preserve memories, but to release them. Pages filled with the slow dying of a mother's hope, the disappointment, the heartbreak. But she also recorded the small new joys. The sunlight on Serafina's shoulders, the scent of the sea at 6 a.m., the return of real, unfettered laughter to her daughter's voice. Serafina would come home from the market with sand dusting her feet, her eyes soft, her shoulders relaxed and no longer hunched. She began to paint again. Seashells, postcards, small frames they hung around the tiny apartment. At night they sat on the floor, eating simple meals of rice, vegetables, or grilled fish with lemon. They played soft music and talked about nothing important. Books, the weather. They intentionally avoided discussing Dominic, Vivian, or the house Eleanor had left behind. They didn't need to. One night, as Eleanor closed her journal, she glanced over at Serafina. She was asleep on the sofa, head tilted back, a faint, contented smile on her lips. It was the kind of sleep that came after a day spent in the sun, the deep rest only achieved when one finally felt safe. Watching her daughter at peace, at home in her own skin, Eleanor felt a profound internal shift. She knew she had made the correct choice. She hadn't just walked out of a house. She had walked away from being unseen, from being needed only when convenient, from a life of silence. She had chosen to live as a woman who still had vital chapters left to write, not as a quiet supporter in someone else's narrative. She whispered, "Thank you," as she turned off the light. Not to fate or a higher power, but to the part of herself that refused to be erased. She thanked the mother who stayed long enough to say, "We're not broken, just rebuilding." And for the first time in many years, Eleanor slept without the crushing weight on her chest. The phone rang on a Tuesday. Serafina was in the kitchen, humming while she stirred a pot of soup. Eleanor was by the window, clipping dead leaves from her basil plant. The number on the screen displayed a familiar area code, one she hadn't seen in months. She almost didn't answer. She picked it up, her heart tightening despite herself. "Grandma, are you okay?" It was Rose, her granddaughter's small voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Eleanor replied, her voice soft. There was a pause. "Grandma, Mom and Dad are. They're scared. The bank sent a letter. They said something about foreclosure." Rose's voice was barely audible. "Dad's been crying. I heard them fighting last night. He said they're going to lose the house. He said it was your house first." The phone clicked. Rose had handed it off. "Mom!" Dominic's voice was on the line, shaky and sounding years older. He hadn't called her Mom since the day she walked out. "I'm sorry," he rushed out, all in one painful breath. "I should have stopped her. I should have said something. I was scared and stupid, and I thought we had time." "Why are you calling me now?" Eleanor asked, not in anger but in quiet fact. He didn't respond immediately. "I need help," he finally admitted. "We need help. They're going to take the house. I tried to fix it, but it's too late. I know I don't deserve to ask, but please come back. We can make space for you again. Vivian." Eleanor laughed once, soft and sad. He stopped talking. She took a deep breath, looking around the small apartment that smelled of lavender and lemon, where the walls were thin but the air was warm. "Dominic," she said gently, "do you remember the day Vivian called me dead weight?" His breath caught. "Yes. Do you remember what you did?" Silence. "Nothing," Eleanor answered for him. "You did nothing. And then you called your sister a leech. You stood by while I was humiliated. And now, months later, you remember I exist because the bank does too." He sobbed once. "Mom, please." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I was a burden to you then," she said. "But I'm not anymore." And then she spoke the sentence she had saved, not for vengeance, but for absolute clarity. "I used to carry that house. Now I carry myself." "What do I tell the kids?" he sniffled. Eleanor smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Tell them their grandmother is doing just fine. And maybe one day when they grow up, they'll understand what you didn't." She hung up the phone. No goodbye. No promises. Just peace. Some mornings, Serafina and Eleanor walked barefoot on the beach, letting the tide nibble at their toes and the wind carry away what was left of the past. Serafina always carried her sandals but never wore them. Eleanor brought her journal, though sometimes she didn't write a word. There was a rhythm to the ocean that felt like forgiveness, not for others but for themselves. Serafina was healing. She laughed now, not too loudly but truly. She sang when she washed dishes. Her physical bruises had faded, though the memory of them still lingered in her eyes. Eleanor planted herbs on the balcony. She sent handwritten recipes to strangers who followed their baking page online. She slept without worry, making her tea in silence and enjoying every sip. Last week, a letter arrived. Real mail, with a stamp and a tiny heart drawn next to her name. It was from Rose, written entirely by the child. Dear Grandma, it began. I hope you are happy. Miss you. I miss the smell of your cookies. I miss your hugs. I told Mommy and Daddy that. Mommy cried. Daddy went outside. I hope I see you again. Love, Rose. There was a drawing of them holding hands, two stick figures in front of what looked like her old house on Sycamore Lane. Rose had drawn a big smile on Eleanor's face. Eleanor held the letter for a long time. She sat in the sunspot on the floor near the window, letting the warmth soak into her knees, reading it again slowly. She folded it gently, pressing it against her heart, and placed it on the windowsill. Later that night, when Serafina was curled up in her blanket, breathing soft and steady, Eleanor read it one last time, and she finally cried, not out of sorrow but release. Tears came for everything she had held inside for too long, for biting her tongue, for the look on Dominic's face when he failed to defend her, for the silence she had mistakenly believed was strength. She cried for Rose, too, knowing children always carry the weight adults refuse to fix. But she did not regret leaving. That was the crucial difference between grief and guilt. Grief says, I miss what I loved. Guilt says, I should have stayed. She had carried both for years, and that night she finally set the guilt down. The next morning before sunrise, she boiled water, sliced lemons, and poured Serafina a cup of tea. Then she sat at their little kitchen table and wrote back. Dear Rose, she began. I miss you too. She told her that her cookies still smelled the same, that she had started growing basil and lavender, and sometimes baked cinnamon bread just for the aroma. She wrote that the beach here was soft and quiet, and the seagulls were pushy little things who always wanted your toast. She made no mention of the house or her parents. That was not Rose's burden. A child deserved to feel wanted, not wedged between adult shame and silence. She sealed the envelope, adding a small pressed violet she had picked on a walk. She wrote the address in her neatest script, even though her hand shook a little as she placed it in the mailbox. Eleanor thought of all the things she had reclaimed. Her voice, her dignity, her space. For years, she had shrunk herself into corners, convinced herself that being needed was the same as being loved. It's not, she murmured to the morning light. Love doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't call you names in the dark. It doesn't slap your hand away when you spill soup or call you dead weight in the room you paid for. Love stays, love speaks, love sees. Now, she walked under the sun with Serafina beside her, and not a single step was quiet. They were loud in their living, loud in their healing. Serafina now sold little jars of sand and poems written on cardstock, and people bought them because they could feel her heart in them. They planted rosemary on the balcony. Serafina said it was for protection. Serafina, Eleanor said, you don't need protection anymore. You have yourself now. And you have me. Eleanor used to live like a shadow, apologizing for taking up space. Now she took up space joyfully, deliberately. Her laughter filled the kitchen. Her memories mattered because she mattered. Years passed, and the small apartment by the sea became more than a refuge. It was a launch pad. Eleanor and Serafina didn't just survive. They lived. They learned to say yes to things they had once been too tired, too sad, or too scared to try. They took road trips, armed only with a paper map, a thermos of cinnamon-flavored coffee, and the radio tuned low to old songs. They drove through sleepy towns, visited the Smoky Mountains when the flowers bloomed fiercely, and wandered through Savannah. Once, on a whim, they flew to Oregon just to witness the vast, stretching lavender fields. They laughed in motel rooms with leaky faucets and danced under gas station lights. They became women who collected experiences, not apologies. In those pages, they didn't write about what they lost. They wrote about who they had become. They sometimes mailed Rose postcards with no return address, notes about seagulls and sunrises. They didn't know if she received them, but they hoped. They had built a home from nothing, and for the first time in a long time they felt rich. But the past has a persistent way of pursuing you, especially when it begins to crumble. One humid afternoon, Eleanor was kneading dough for honey rolls. The air smelled of salt and cinnamon. The phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. Then Serafina's phone buzzed. Same number. Neither woman moved, just looking at the screens. Another call, another voicemail, then silence. Finally, Serafina tapped the screen and pressed play. It was Dominic. His voice was hollow, urgent, profoundly lost. Mom. Sarah. It's bad, his breath shook. Vivian and I, we made some mistakes. Gambling. Some debts. We're being evicted. It's all falling apart. We don't know where to go. A long, choking silence followed. Please just call back. Please. He sounded neither angry nor ashamed, only utterly lost. Eleanor looked at Serafina. Serafina opened her phone, blocked the number and set it down. Eleanor did the same. There was no victory between them, no rage, no glee, just a shared, profound stillness. They didn't need to speak about it, because the truth was starkly simple. They had given Dominic and Vivian more than money. They had given them years and chances. When they had the opportunity to choose kindness, they chose power. When they could have stood up for love, they chose silence. Now, they were drowning in the predictable consequences of their own creation. Eleanor and Serafina had simply learned how to swim without them. Eleanor wondered, only briefly, if Vivian still looked back at that kitchen and remembered the woman she slapped. She wondered if Dominic ever thought of the macaroni pictures he used to make. But those thoughts were theirs to carry now, not hers. Let the guilt sit in the rooms where they no longer lived. They had miles to go, sunrises to catch. Forgiveness, Eleanor realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet morning with tea in hand, where you finally breathed without waiting to be heard again. They forgave, not because the others deserved it, but because Eleanor and Serafina deserved peace. She didn't return. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to explain, and no one left to apologize to. If someone ever calls you a burden, Eleanor later wrote in her journal, remembering Rose's letter and the women who would read her story, if they sigh when you enter the room or look past you when you speak, I want you to stop and hear me now. You are not dead weight. You are the one who paid the bills no one saw, who kept the house warm and the meals hot, even when your own heart was breaking. You are a vessel of wisdom, a survivor of silence. When a woman like you walks out of a room, she takes the warmth with her, and that chill, that ache in their bones they can't quite name, that's the absence of your grace. Eleanor now lived loudly in her new home. She didn't owe anyone her savings, her old age, or her forgiveness if they hadn't earned it. She chose to stand tall, having carried the past and deciding to set it down. She was not invisible. She was not a mistake to be tolerated. She was the author of her own life. She wrote boundaries that held, and silence that spoke louder than any insult they had whispered behind a closed door. Because the echo of her footsteps walking away, that sound was louder than anything she could have screamed. Eleanor Vance was finally free.